Good afternoon and welcome to B-Sides Las Vegas. This is attacking your adversaries, operationalizing cyber intelligence in your own environment for better sleep and a safer tomorrow. We'd like to thank our sponsors, especially the Inner Circle sponsors, Critical Stack and Valley Mail, and our stellar sponsors, Amazon, BlackBerry, and Cylance. If you could please put all of your phones on silent, please, and at the end there'll be 10 minutes of questions. Please make an orderly queue by the microphone. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So yeah, long title. Thank you for reading that. We're from MITRE, and we're here to talk about operationalizing attacks, specifically taking threat intelligence and applying it to improve your defenses, specifically through emulating adversaries and writing detections and analytics based on that emulation. Before we go forward, we're going to do some quick introductions, hopefully to establish some credibility, why you should trust us. My name is Jamie. I'm an engineer at MITRE. I mostly work on adversary emulation, so the red team side, but I do some detection work, mostly detecting myself, so a little bit of purple team flavor if you're familiar with that concept. This is actually my second B-Sides, first time in Vegas, so this is pretty awesome. Previously, I presented at B-Sides DC.
Cool. And I'm Sarah Yoder, also an engineer at MITRE. I tend to focus a little bit more on the cyber threat intelligence side, especially within attack, and do a little bit of red teaming as well. This is also my first time, not only at B-Sides Las Vegas, but really any B-Sides, so we're really happy to be here and talk with you guys today. We both work on the core attack team as well as attack evaluations.
So the answer to your question is yes, we do have attack stickers, so by all means come up after the talk and we can give you some of those if you want, or talk about anything attack. So if you were here last year, a couple of our colleagues, Katie Nichols and John Wonder, presented Attacking the Status Quo. This is a really excellent talk, but the main focus was cyber intelligence. Basically the idea of how do you process, find, and digest intelligence and create analytics based on that. The slides are there on that link. I think it's Katie's slide share. Definitely check that out. But if I need to sell you more on that, it's littered with like really awesome memes. Here's one of them. If you think that's funny, the rest of the deck will be equally amazing. So going forward, our agenda today, we're actually going to build on top of that. So that's kind of the foundation where we're starting. So Sarah's going to give you a really good overview of intelligence, not only what it is, but where to find it and how to use it. The use specifically is carving out behaviors from that intelligence. So, this is kind of a more tangible unit of measurement when we talk about intelligence. From there, we're going to talk about writing detections and analytics based on those behaviors, as well as emulating those behaviors and talking about the interaction between the analytics you derive as well as the emulation and how those kind of play back and forth.
Great. So we'll begin with how to find behaviors from intelligence. But before we dive into that, I feel like we need to define what cyber threat intelligence is. So I like this definition. It's sweet, short, gets to the point. But basically, it's the process of analyzing information in a way that can help network defenders and decision makers. So when we're talking about analyzing information, where does that come from? What kind of information are we talking about? So as a cyber threat analyst, a lot of people would spend their days looking at all these different resources as well as many more. And going back to that definition a second ago, if I was really good with PowerPoint, I would have funneled these all together, and basically the output of making all the connections from these different sources into that actionable item is cyber threat intelligence. So all of this information can be really overwhelming, hard to keep track of, but fear not. Attack can help. Handy dandy matrix man will help us map these behaviors to attack. So what is attack? In case you're not aware, it's a knowledge base of adversary behavior. So it's a really good place to start if you've never heard of APT&CKing or a certain malware. It's a great place to start and start building your defenses based on that information. It's based on real-world observations. So nothing in there is classified. Everything is open source and publicly available. References are at the bottom of each page. That way you can go to that report yourself and see that information for yourself. It's free, open, and globally accessible. Check it out at attack.mitre.org. And last, but definitely not least, it is community driven. We rely heavily on the community to help make it better, whether that's adding a new group that you're researching, or if we don't have something quite right, we want to hear about that to make it better for everybody. So how attack is structured is in this matrix format. Along the top row in blue, the column headers are our tactics. And you can think of this as the adversary's goal. So I know they're a little hard to see, but the adversary's goal is to gain initial access. Their goal later on is probably going to be to laterally move, escalate their privileges, and so on. Within each column, in the white cells that we have, those are the techniques, which is how that goal is actually achieved. So for example, maybe an adversary, their goal was to laterally move, and they did that via pass the hash. We can then dive a little bit deeper at the procedure level, which is how that technique was actually implemented. In this example here, access token manipulation falls under privilege escalation and defense evasion, but by getting to that procedure level of what the adversary was actually doing in that time, helps differentiate which tactic that falls under. All right, so from here, we can kind of move into the what is a behavior. So this is where we're moving away from our traditional hash values, signatures, IPs, domain names, etc., and moving more into this format of answering these questions of why, how, what. So I kind of like to think of this a little bit as if you were to write indicators on me, maybe you would say I have blondish hair, I'm wearing a black t-shirt, like 5'3"-ish. So those are maybe my indicators, but my behavior is that I go to Starbucks every morning at 8 a.m. and order a coffee and put cream in that coffee. So if you were writing your detections to find me in a crowd based on me wearing a black t-shirt, well, tomorrow if I wear a red shirt, that detection is not very good anymore. However, if we're focusing more on that behavior of looking for somebody that's getting coffee, very particular amount of cream, you're gonna have better luck. So how do we find these behaviors? My role on the attack team is reading finished reports like the one that you see up here and finding behaviors that will then map to attack. So things I look for is generally in finished reporting like this, the authors tend to say kind of like that first bullet. The Trojan, in this case it was a Synac ransomware. So the Trojan obfuscates. Okay, it told me what it was and it's telling me something that it's doing. So that's what we're gonna build our behavior off of. So I'm gonna read through this whole chunk of text and look for anytime I see that the Trojan, the malware, anything like that is doing something. That's generally a good indicator. So from here, we're gonna map that to attack. I like to start with the tactic because there's currently 12 of them, and so it narrows the scope of what this is gonna fall under, and everything goes back to what the adversary's goal was. So I'll pick on that first one. So it's obfuscating code. Okay, that's probably because it doesn't want to be found. That's probably going to fall under defense evasion. I'm going to take that methodology throughout the whole bit of text. So in this one, we have a lot of defense evasion, as well as a little discovery. So once we have the tactics, we can move on to techniques. Now, since I've already done the tactics, again, this narrows the field. I can look within that particular column. So in this first example, defense evasion, narrows down what I'm looking for because I realize the matrix can be a little overwhelming. Another thing I do at this step is I look for keywords in the text and try to just use the attack search bar to try to narrow down what I'm looking for. Like if you type in obfuscate, then you're gonna start to see that that there's a technique called obfuscated files. I do confirm that by reading what that technique is. But we do this through the whole bit of text. That information all gets put into probably what most of you know as attack. In this example, we're using Synac to do that.
So now that we have a profile of something, in this case, malware that we want to detect, we can start looking at how we build, at least at a notional level, detections based on that. So we're transitioning from an index of all the behaviors of that malware to writing actual detections for that. So getting back, actually, before we continue, it's probably good, at least in detections, to kind of add another layer of context in describing and kind of looking at a behavior. So one way I kind of look at it, which is really helpful for detections, is to carve out behaviors into stages. So like most things in life, there's a before, there's a during, and an after. So one way to look at a behavior is to look at prerequisites, so things that need to happen before the behavior or technique is executed, the mechanics, what happens when the actual behavior is executed, and then obviously artifacts at the end, the residual or forensic things that are kind of left behind from the execution of the behavior. So mapping that just notionally to sysmon event IDs, so prerequisites, we'd see things like, drivers being loaded, DLLs being loaded, things like that. Mechanics, we'd see like kind of process level activity, like create no thread, reads, etc. And then residual artifacts would be things like file creation, file writes, or things in the registry, network connections, if we're talking about like a beacon or something. So kind of, I'll circle back to this later and map all of our stuff for our actual use case, but this is definitely a useful and probably interesting way to kind of look at a detection or in the context of a behavior. So getting back to what the mapping Sarah went through, we can start looking at the behaviors we're dealing with and just go down one by one and figure out how are we actually going to defend against this. So it's kind of small, but does anyone in the front couple rows see anything particularly interesting that they want to see in this example? Like if you had to start with one, what would you just notionally pick? I'm going to call on you guys in the front.
Modify registry keys or manipulate registry.
Interesting choice. Unfortunately, I did not pick that one. So, fun trivia fact. This is actually my favorite thing in attack, process doppelganging. It was a great guess, but process doppelganging is so interesting to me, and I hope to prove that to you. I'm not going to sell you too hard on this, but it's pretty interesting. So we'll walk through writing a detection for that, as well as how to emulate that, and let's get going. So before we start with anything, let's understand what is that. So the actual idea was presented at Black Hat Europe 2 years ago. Really awesome researchers. You should go check out the slides. And there's a video. It's kind of small on the bottom, but you can check it out. Basically, the idea, it's an alternative for process injection. So the idea is to load and execute malicious code in a separate process. What really makes it interesting is it avoids the typical artifacts with process injection. So there's no create remote thread, and there's also no file writes to disk. So things like AV scanners might miss something like this. In terms of the actual mechanics of the technique, it's two-part. It's really interesting. There's two main parts. The first part is it relies on something called transactional NTFS. Basically, the idea, this is a deprecated idea from Microsoft, but it's still enabled, funny enough. But what makes it really cool, or the way this works, is kind of like database file locks. Basically, so say Sarah and I are two processes, we don't want to fork a file or overwrite each other. So it enables a process the ability to lock a file, write to it, and then unlock it so that no one else touches it. That's deprecated, but it still works. So in the second half of this is these guys reverse engineered the create process API code path, and they found an undocumented API that rather than calling something on disk, like executing a binary on disk, you can actually execute a memory section. So you can kind of hopefully see how those two things align, and it could be actually pretty interesting. And if that's not super clear, I spent about an hour making an animation here, so hopefully this will help make that super obvious. So there's 4 main steps to doppelganging. It all starts with a legitimate file on disk. Step 1 is to create a transaction. So you create this lock to the file, and you override it with your malicious content. The second is to load it. So you load that file into memory. So now you have this malicious content in memory under the name of its previous, whatever it happened to be on disk. Third is roll back the transaction. So like I said before, you had that file lock. There's actually a part of NTFS transactions is the ability to undo a change. So you can undo that change, which in terms of looking at it on disk, the file is back to being legitimate. So AV is going to miss that. But now you have this residual thing floating in memory, which is actually malicious. And as you can see before on that API talk, final step is animate it. So you kind of separate the file on disk from the file in memory, and you execute that memory section. So now you have something malicious running in memory, which actually doesn't point to anything on disk. Super interesting. So going forward, this is actually, so what Sarah talked about before, there's tactics and techniques and procedures and attack. Within each technique, there's also metadata. So we can check out things like data sources, notional ways to detect or mitigate all these techniques. So some jerk, cough, cough, wrote all this, curated this from the internet. This is actual content from attack on how to detect doppelgang. It's split into 3 main parts. I try to make it a little easier to read by highlighting the crucial parts. But the top section is API monitoring. So looking at transactional NTFS is done through API calls, and they're very unique. So if you're API monitoring, you would actually see all these happening, as well as these undocumented API calls. Those would be pretty good indicators that this technique is going down. So in terms of a data source, before we move into detecting this, you should just think about API monitoring in terms of what you need to be looking for. The next thing is file monitoring. So what's really interesting, when a process is started, there's this routine that happens. If you have the ability to do this, it's actually might be a little complex, but a good way to detect this would be anytime a process is started, check out the file that's being executed and see if it has write enabled. Typically, you don't see, when someone creates like a handle to a file, they don't enable write and execute, because why would you do that? So executing something that has previously been written to is maybe a little weird. But in terms of moving on, as well as, this is actually maybe a little more complex, but comparing things in memory to things on disk, it takes a lot of resources, but that also may be an opportunity to detect this kind of behavior. So we kind of just bucket that under the data source of file monitoring. And then finally, this is true for most process injection, process monitoring. So taking a look at a process and kind of understanding, is this something that process is typically, should be doing or typically does? So an example would be like explorer.exe. If that's like, doing a lot of file I/O and making a lot of network connections and doing like LDAP queries, you're probably going to have a bad day. Shouldn't be happening, and that's probably a really good indicator of some type of injection. So we can bucket that under process monitoring. So this kind of going forward into an actual emulation, this is kind of like we would get this mindset of where we need to be looking for artifacts of the actual behavior, as well as like other opportunities that don't fit into this existing model. So this is actually my favorite part, emulating it. So we've talked about it, we've understood it, but let's actually do something. So funny enough, I actually started for this presentation, I started writing custom code. I think I got like half an hour in before I obviously had to run to Google and search something. And I forgot the exact string I searched, but there was one hit, and it happened to be an already done proof of concept for this. So shout out to Ruben for already doing doppelganging via PowerShell, which is exactly what I was trying to do. The source is there. It's under his PowerShell suite project. The actual payload is start Adolin. I think it's a Dota term. I'm not really sure what that means, but it's super cool. And in terms of, I'm a attack nerd, so every time I see something, I map it to attack immediately. So it's Windows API calls as well as PowerShell. So I decided not to trust the demo gods. So I pre-recorded a demonstration of this. So before I started, I'll talk about the command line arguments. So at this point, I've already started a PowerShell session, and I've loaded the module into memory. So I'm going to run that command, obviously calling the function. The first argument for target is the target file that I'm going to overwrite. So I'm going to overwrite calc.exe. The second flag for Mimicat says it actually has embedded within the PowerShell, it has the Mimikat's binary. So I'm going to doppelgang calc with Mimikatz. And then it's a demonstration, so obviously enabled veracity, so you can see all the output. So kind of what's happening here. That's me putzing on the command line. I run it. You see all the output true, so that looks good. There's some really great output here. You can see like memory addresses and stuff, so in case you want to go and forensic look at this. Popped off screen, there's our Mimikatz. The icon is calc, so we fold the Windows tray thing, so awesome. Just to confirm that it worked the way I thought, Process Explorer, look at the process tree to make sure it makes sense. So we scroll down, I find my Explorer for my user session. There's the CMD, the PowerShell, and then coming off that PowerShell, we see this idle process, which is identified as calculator. So it looks like the emulation worked. So we do have Mimikatz running in memory as calc. It's super neat. So now that we understand, we've confirmed it worked, let's see what actually happened on disk in terms of detection. So I used Detection Lab for this, as well as some tools. I labeled everything, so you should be able to replicate this if you want. So the first thing I started with Sysmon. This is actually Spunk. I pumped it to a Sysmon index. I looked around for a little bit, didn't actually see anything that was like really interesting besides this one process create. So you can see that PowerShell process spawned calc.exe. So it's not necessarily incriminating, but I was digging through the fields and trying to find something that was interesting. The only thing I found that was somewhat interesting was the hash. I was wondering if that was like an illegitimate hash. So I took it to VirusTotal. Nope, it's not. It wasn't identified as anything malicious. It actually preserved the hash and the signature of legit calc. So that's actually, it's not useless, but it's like not indicative of something malicious. But it's something that we can definitely put in our back pocket and look at later as like part of a bigger detection strategy. So this is Sysmon. Moving on to the next thing. Countercept has this really excellent blog on detecting malicious.NET usage. So the link is there. They actually put out a POC for detecting API calls through .NET. It's actually built on top of the FireEye Pi WinTrace project. So those two links are on the right there. So I was able to take that POC from Countercept and kind of massage it a little bit for this use case. So that's the output. It's tiny. It's actually a lot. But what I want to highlight is if you dig through it, you're able to actually see the API calls that are associated with doppelganging and all that process create. I intentionally left it small because it is really hard to look at, and it's actually, this methodology is really hard to scale. So kind of keep that in mind. This is actually really indicative of malicious behavior, but deploying this over 50,000 hosts, or even 2, would be really hard to do. But it's something that we can definitely keep in our back pocket and consider later. Third, Procmon, pretty straightforward, sysinternals. So I took that into the range, set it up, launched it, was able to find the PowerShell process and went through the trace from that. Interesting point here is you're able to see the file event. So you're seeing PowerShell, write to calc, and then you see that second line is like create a lock. So I'm assuming that's the transactional NTFS. So it locks the file, it does some reads and writes, it creates a file mapping, which I think is it loading it into memory, and then it the third and fourth from the bottom is it like unlocking the file. So as you see, it kind of like rolls back that transaction and releases the file. And then the last two is it creating a thread and a process based on calc. So this in itself isn't inherently malicious, but like I said, it's kind of a higher level view of the ETW. It's a little more accessible data, and paired with some other things, you can kind of start painting this full picture. Final thing, I didn't actually expect this, but I did see it in a tweet one time. I don't know who tweeted it because they deleted either the tweet or their entire account. But if you're watching this, wherever you are, thank you. So there is a security event in the Windows event cache or whatever for transaction changes. It's the 4985 event. It's actually not super descriptive. The title is the state of a transaction has changed, which is kind of not useless, but not super explicit, I guess. But interesting facts here was there's 2 of them. So I'm assuming the transaction start and end. And in my case, I didn't put there's no sleep in the emulation. So they happen within a second of each other, which is kind of neat, I guess. And within the metadata of the event, there's really nothing interesting there. I couldn't figure out what a lot of those fields meant. Like the new state isn't documented anywhere. It's just kind of a value. But what's useful here is you're able to see the process information. So you're able to see that PowerShell actually spawned this event, which I went back through the other events on the system that were the same event ID. And the only other things doing this was trusted installer and SVC host. So an interesting way to key on this would be is something outside of like a whitelist is doing a transaction. Because these transactions are deprecated, things that typically Microsoft probably isn't doing on their end anymore, and probably isn't super common on a system. So rolling all that up, like I said before, going back to those 3 stages. For prerequisites, we can kind of look at all that output from Procmon, so all those file events, the writes, those would be the prerequisites for the doppelganging or the starting of the process. In terms of the actual mechanics, there's 2 parts here. You can see the sysmon events, so the PowerShell spawning the calc, as well as the data provided from ETW, the event tracer from Windows, so all those API calls. And then finally, the residual things that are left behind, you're going to look at those Windows event IDs, the 4985s. Kind of like I said before, mapping it to the structure really gives you a good perspective on what you're dealing with, and you can kind of start putting together like a notional approach to actually defending this. So in this case, there's probably a million ways to do this. My approach that I just kind of thought of was starting with the Windows event log. So saying anytime you see this event ID with something that is like a user line process like CMD or PowerShell, or it's not like trust installer or SVC host, fire an alert on that and then start working backwards. So you get that alert and you say, hey, this process created a transaction, that's weird. Immediately go to sysmon and see the parent-child relationship, so see what spawned off from that. And then from there, maybe ETW is kind of hard to scale, but enable it just on those 2 processes and say, hey, what are these 2 guys doing? Or 3 or whatever, how many that lineage looks like. Enable everything there so you get really good introspection. And if you want to confirm that this is actually doppelganging, take a look at the file events and say, hey, has anyone in this process tree actually been doing writes? And you can actually, like I said, those transaction data is actually in Procmon. So you're able to kind of correlate and paint that full picture. So this is actually a really big point on why you actually emulate behaviors instead of just writing detections, because you're able to see the trade-offs as well as the additional artifacts that you didn't necessarily consider when you were just understanding the technique. A big point also is once you've done all this and you have something really solid, don't keep it between your ears. Share it, write it down. There's some really great places to do this. MITRE, we actually have our own internal, it's called the Cyber Analytic Repository. It's on GitHub. Basically, it's an index of a bunch of analytics for how to detect behaviors in attack. We're always looking for contributions, so if it's this technique or something else, submit it there, as well as there's some really other great projects. If you've heard of like Sigma or in-games EQW or EQL, and there's other like OS Query, there's great places to kind of document this and not just get it written down, but share it with the community, get feedback, and kind of build like the industry and practice entirely.
Great. So just to expand a little bit on everything Jamie just touched on, we also wanted to point out another resource if you're interested in emulating techniques or whole operations yourself would be caldera. I don't know if anybody in this room was able to attend their training yesterday, but they went very in depth with how to do this. I'm going to do it in a minute. But basically for this, the start eidolon payload, I use the same one, but in this tool, you just add the payload to the payloads folder, pretty straightforward. We then create a new ability that references that payload, and in this example, I added a new adversary to then reference that ability. So as you can see, there we go, that I ran it, the file stamp's the same because it was just detecting, or like it just was telling me that it ran it. I could then go through all the steps that Jamie went through to actually detect all the artifacts of that, that script. But what is particularly interesting to me with Caldera is that you can actually emulate an entire operation. So I took this from their default noisy neighbor operation, but you could apply it to, in this example, maybe the Synac malware at large, or any APT group, or really whatever you want. So as you can see, in this operation, it goes through lateral movement, discovery, execution. All of that you can customize to what you're hoping to emulate. So with that.
Okay. So yeah, we kind of blew through that really quickly. So we'll have a lot of time for like questions and comments and discussions if you guys want. But just to kind of summarize what we talked about today, 3 main points. First one is understand your adversaries, not just where to get information about these adversaries, but what they're doing. So not, a lot of times we see a lot of focus on indicators, which is useful and has its practice, but in terms of like, really we preach and kind of like very often push this idea of threat-informed defense, like Sarah mentioned earlier. Understand your adversaries and apply that to everything you do defensively. So whether you're buying something, installing something, setting a configuration, use the justification for that action to point to a specific thing adversaries do that makes that, whatever that move makes sense. And like Sarah said before, when you're looking at this intelligence, don't just look at indicators, look at the what, hows, and whys. And attack really helps build that framework and structure for documenting and understanding all these different portions. Secondly, emulate behaviors. So like it showed, understanding behavior is one thing, and like really understanding like how it works and how it could be done, but emulating will uncover more information, like things that you didn't expect, or like typically there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's also many ways to execute a technique. So like Sarah said before, there's very different procedures for any given behavior or technique. So you really want to get a pretty good wider scope of the breadth of many different ways you can execute something. And finally, apply emulations to your environment. Whatever you have in your environment, you need to tune your defenses specifically to what you have. So you may have more or less than things that we document online or other people are talking about. So you definitely want to understand and make best use of whatever resources you have available for you. So we're going to leave this slide up. This is our contact information. So attack is on that first URL. We have a blog, Medium site, where we do some interesting articles about various other use cases of attack, as well as there's our email and our Twitter if you want to obviously send us something or contribute something to attack. Like as Sarah said before, I think the running number is 70% of the content in the last year was from contributions in the community. So we definitely appreciate all the adoption from the community, as well as everything you guys do to help us improve and maintain attack. So yeah, like I said, we got through that really quick. We had probably a little too much coffee this morning, but if we have any questions, we can flip back through slides, talk about attack in general, and we have stickers, so if anyone's interested, definitely come up and we can give you a couple stickers and business cards and whatnot. Otherwise, thank you for your time, and awesome.